Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are all set. We will now begin the roundtable session under the theme, How Will Life Be in Tomorrow's World? And Mr. David Pilling, author and Africa editor of the Financial Times, will be our moderator of this session. So please welcome him and the speakers for the session with a warm round of applause.
And the stock market.
Thank you very much, everybody. How will life be in tomorrow's world? My name is David Pilling. I'm the Africa editor of the Financial Times. I also wrote a book called The Growth Delusion, which I think is coming out in Korean, just my one and only plug, which addresses some of the questions that I think will be sort of discussed over the next 3 days. As the opening roundtable discussion, it really falls upon us, or really my fellow panel members, to set the tone for this conference. And according to the title, to peer into the future. This is called a high-level panel, so panelists, the pressure is on. There was a program called Tomorrow's World that aired in Britain for many, many years. This program used to have things like flying cars, exploding pens, supersonic high-speed travel. One of the things that I think became quite apparent about Tomorrow's World is that the future is extremely difficult to predict, and yet that is what we are tasked with doing here in the next 90 minutes. The OECD has worked for at least a decade now on the links between statistics, policy, and a broader definition of sustainable well-being. It has now become, as we've heard in some of the speeches we've already heard, almost a new orthodoxy in academia and policy circles, if not necessarily in the broader public debate yet, that income and production growth alone, as measured by GDP, cannot be our only guide. But still, we're far from reaching a consensus about what to measure, and certainly we're far from a consensus about how to act upon those measurements. Just one very simple example. There's pretty much now scientific consensus that we should be measuring CO2, that CO2 is, in very simple terms, bad, that CO2 is a measure of climate change, a marker of climate change, and in fact a cause of climate change. And yet the world's biggest economy and the second biggest producer of CO2 has pulled out of the Paris Accord. And it's certainly at federal level, if not necessarily at state level, has kind of renounced acting upon that measure. So you can see we don't have consensus even upon something as simple as that. So how can we agree, how can we talk even about the future of well-being if we can't agree on what well-being looks like today? And I think that's one of the sort of issues we might grapple with here in this panel. Does well-being, for example, as I think many people would agree, mean a more equal society? And yet, today, we're all aware of that today, and yet in many parts of the world we seem to be moving in an opposite direction. And while we might have convergence of incomes globally, as some nations, particularly China, catch up with the rest of the world, within nations, and particularly within advanced nations, the OECD nations, we're seeing income inequality go in the opposite direction. Are we talking about a future in which multilateral institutions, of which the OECD is obviously one, work more closely together, when in the future those very same institutions appear to be under tremendous pressure and strain from the rising forces of nationalism and something that we might call sort of anti-globalism? Does the future mean more automation so that humans have more leisure time? Or have indeed we not yet really figured out how technology can be put in the service of work-life balance? It was, after all, nearly 90 years ago that John Maynard Keynes predicted that today we would all be working 15-hour weeks because of technology something that, a prediction about the future that clearly has not come true. Does the future mean a more connected society? And if so, are we not already confused about whether the internet and the social media is bringing us all more together or driving us all further apart? It's certainly a future in which we're all likely to be living longer, but what does that mean for our healthcare systems, our pension systems? And also, whose well-being are we talking about? President Moon Jae-in said yesterday he was talking about people-centered growth as opposed to merely the growth of GDP. But how about planet-centered growth or biodiversity-centered growth? Is that also something we might discuss and consider? So these are just some of the questions that I think will come up in this panel. We certainly want the audience to be engaged, so please think of questions, and we'll bring in the audience, I hope fairly early on in the discussion. Now, we have an amazing panel, and I've spoken to them all in advance, so I know that they have very different sort of research areas, opinions, levels of areas of expertise. If I go from my left, we have Monica Kweiser, the head of social policy division at the OECD. Olivia Bina, research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences, University of Lisbon. We have Christine Peterson, a futurist, a nano-educator, and co-founder of the Foresight Institute. And I'm not quite sure what a nano-educator is. I assume it's someone who teaches very, very small people. But we'll ask you in due course. We have Enrique Rueda Sabater, a senior advisor to Boston Consulting Group. And on my very far left, we have Park Young-suk, chair and president of the South Korean node of the Millennium Project, and the author, very appropriately, of the 2018 UN State of the Future report. Christine, I'd like to start with you. You can, in passing, if you like, tell us what a nano-educator is. But I would also like you just to kind of, in a sense, set the scene. You think about the future for a living. Just putting well-being sort of to the side for 1 second, I'd just like to ask you how you think the world might be different in 15 years' time. And let's keep our horizon to roughly 15 years into the future. Specifically, I guess, in the worlds of work and technology. And how might that impact this discussion that we're going to have about well-being?
Thank you, David. I like to divide these areas into 3 topics. First, let's start with digital. We're all aware, we heard in the keynotes about the coming changes in employment patterns. We're going to be seeing increasing unemployment and underemployment caused by AI and robotics. One slight tweak I'd like to make is we heard earlier that these will start with low-skilled jobs. I think there's a slightly different way to think about it. If you envision a layer in the middle of software, this is the software layer. You have some people who are fortunate enough to work above the software layer. These people tell the machines what to do. Then you have people who work below the software layer. These people have jobs where the software tells them what to do. These are folks perhaps who drive ride-share cars. These are folks who work at the large companies like Amazon who put together packages that go out in the mail. So they are being told by software what to do. These jobs are not necessarily high-paying jobs. So the reason why the layer comes in the middle rather than right at the bottom is that it turns out that robotics is harder to do than artificial intelligence. Software is, in some ways, easier to do than robotics. So we can talk later about how do you respond to these patterns in employment. Another area in the digital world that was mentioned very briefly in the keynotes was cybersecurity. You're all aware that keeping your computer secure is an ongoing battle You get continual security updates. These are sent to you all the time by software manufacturers, trying to get you to update your machines. It feels like an ongoing battle because that's what it is. And it's only going to get worse over the next 10 to 15 years. We've already seen cases of extortion of money through these holes in your computer software. What worries me much more is state actors using these things to exert pressure between two countries. We've also seen cases of that already in the world. And also, our utilities are highly vulnerable, and that means well-being is at great risk. And I'd say that's true in every country today. The more advanced countries are more at risk because they are more computerized. So that's digital. In the area of governance, the patterns I would be looking for are developments in what is called open source law and smart contracts. Both of these are patterns where you have international sharing of best practices in legal areas. This is cross boundaries, cross-national. So it allows people in each country to, in part, choose the jurisdiction that they wish to use for their contracts. And smart contracts, or automatically executed contracts, are coming using technologies such as the blockchain, which I'm sure we will be hearing from Professor Park later on. But again, these are international, and they are not necessarily visible to governments. So you're going to be having people doing business that's not as visible. This can be good. It can allow the avoidance of corruption in government, but it can also lead to avoidance of taxes. And I'm sure we'll be talking about ways that governments will be addressing this. Finally, from the private sector, I look to them for solutions to the increasing burden on our advanced societies of the aging population, frail elders, very large numbers of frail elders. And even in the continent of Africa, David, as we were discussing, the burden of aging is increasing. Even in the developing countries, there's a risk that they are getting old before they get rich. We turn to the private sector for innovation. How are we going to cope with the situation of large number of frail elders, and can we, by addressing the underlying problems of aging through science, actually compress this time frame of frailty among our elders?
Can I just follow up on, I mean, you've raised several issues, and we'll follow up on many of them during the course of the discussion, but just on the kind of digitalization of work, if that's a concept. How real is this? For example, we talk about e-commerce. We open our computer, we click online, a book arrives. What we may not consciously realize, unless we stop to think about it, is actually there's not much E about that. There's all sorts of people in warehouses, driving trucks, delivering. There's a whole, there's hundreds of thousands of people doing different jobs than they would have done before. They're not working in a bookshop now, they're working in a windowless warehouse in the middle of nowhere, taking instructions, as you say, from computers, packing books, packing toys, packing whatever. That's then shipped out. Have you done any predictions on kind of how many jobs will go as a result of technology, and where those jobs will go? Or are we sort of exaggerating this? Is it just that the nature of jobs will change?
There are many different people looking at this. You'll get different answers.
Always.
I think it's a wide variety. I think the way I think about it is, yes, we will see new jobs, many new jobs, and they will be primarily above this layer. These will be what I think of as gold-collar jobs. These are going to be wonderfully fun, exciting jobs, and there will be some. The problem is you have, for the folks who are less fortunate, do not have the levels of education and skills, what's happening to their jobs? Are they as fulfilling as they used to be? Are they as numerous as they used to be? And I think if you look even now, today, at both the US and in Europe, you're seeing what happens politically when people do not feel that their children will have a better life than they have. they start to vote in more extreme fashions. And we're seeing it in the US. I think we're starting to see it in Europe as well. And it doesn't necessarily drive them hard right or hard left. It can alternate. Whoever is willing to make the most extreme promises for I will give you jobs. They want jobs. So in terms of numbers, I think, yes, there'll be some new jobs, but not as many as the jobs that are being lost by a lot. And also the type of jobs that are coming in are not necessarily ones that these folks are equipped to step up to.
Thank you very much. Professor Park, if I could bring you in. We've now got a vision of a world in which we have gold-collar jobs. Presumably there's a few platinum-collar jobs as well for those really, really successful people. And then presumably there's a whole other level. I don't know what we would name them, wooden collar, iron collar, jobs further down. My question for you is really, what does the future look like? I mean, again, this is what you spend your life thinking about. If we do nothing, will well-being improve as a result of these changes that are being set in motion now, or will well-being deteriorate?
Well, I'm very positive in the future.
Okay.
Optimistic. If you do not do anything, of course, we'll have a whole lot of problems. However, I think there are many ways to deal with all these problems. I worked for the British government 20 years and 10 years with the Australian government. All these governments are trying to do something. And the Millennium Project Korea has done quite a lot of research on the jobs, work, tech 2050. We go all the way to 2050. And the jobs are disappearing, basically with the AI, nanobiome, all these high tech. We call it next technologies, emerging technologies. With the emerging technologies, they are better. AIs are better, and also robotics are better. So we give them better jobs or chores to do. However, we consider by 2030 or 2035, we will have a universal basic income. We have to have all those measures, otherwise people will revolt to the protesting and staging rallies, demonstrations here and there. We are very good at, Koreans are very good at doing all the rallies and demonstrations. So governments have to have some sort of universal basic income, and with the universal basic income, you will have emerging technologies cutting down the cost of living. Therefore, you do not have to spend so much money in housing and clothes and living costs. Therefore, we think that next technologies will lower the cost of healthcare, education, entertainment, energy, transportation, construction, and the general maintenance and all that. Therefore, we will sort of combine the social welfare system into a single universal basic system to give away money to individuals who are in that country, So I know that some European countries such as Finland and Netherlands, they give away basic income and they are quite successful. I know that around 8 or 9 countries are doing that, partially, not whole, but partially. So that with the lowering the income, the living cost, we will not seek for jobs, we will seek for work. Instead of jobs getting paid, if you get the basic income, why do you need a job? You go out, find a work that you like, volunteering on climate change and clean water, clean air, all those activities can be done by your work.
Okay. I think we'll pick up on the idea of a universal basic income and different kind of variations of that in a minute. But I'd like to ask either Olivia or Monica, or maybe both. I just want to pick up something that you've said, this idea that everything's going to get cheaper, basically, because of technology. and if we could focus on healthcare, because healthcare, certainly, that's not what's happening in the present. Healthcare is getting, if you look at America, more and more and more expensive. And individual healthcare, personalized healthcare, genome-based healthcare, healthcare that can cure things that were incurable a little while ago, can be phenomenally expensive, at least at first. Would either of you like to comment on this idea that healthcare and other things are going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as a result of technology? Because there is an opposing view, I guess.
Thank you, David. I guess one of the interesting things, just listening to our colleagues and linking the issue of technology and access, basically increased access to the services that we all need and want, and that are very directly linked to the whole notion of well-being
Yes.
that we discussed. So, and health, of course, being perhaps one of the primary ones. I think we are extremely optimistic, and it is important to be extremely optimistic. But the truth is, we've sat here listening to a video that showed us how unequal access to many things that matter to us and that matter to well-being are today. So it is impossible for us to know what the future will look like. It is possible for us to know what we desire from the future and what we can possibly do today to make sure that what our colleagues have illustrated has even a remote chance to actually be true tomorrow, let alone in 15 years' time. So I think it's really a challenge for us to think very clearly, why is it that we are today where we are, despite, I was just commenting with our colleagues from OECD, OECD has done a fabulous job over 3 decades to track unequivocally the rise in inequality in the richest countries in the world. What do we have to show to the rest of the world? How is it possible that we are still here having to tell ourselves that this is the situation today? What can we change tomorrow? Now, in my view, the fact that we are here is the best sign possible that there is a possibility to turn that around. Angel Gurria this morning used my favorite words, that well-being is the ultimate goal of policymaking. But we need to follow up and be consistent with these statements, and we have not been clearly.
I'm going to bring Monica in a second, but Olivia, if I could just follow up one thing. You say we don't know the future, which is clearly true. However, we do know about early childhood development, interventions or lack of interventions early on in someone's life can be crucial. We also know that someone who is 100 years old in 2100 is already 18 years old today. Some of these things are already baked in, I guess. What can you tell us about, disadvantage at early stages of development, of a person's development?
I think here I would like to link always thinking of health to one theme that was touched upon by our keynote.
Yes.
Which is health and mental health to a certain extent. And the importance of valuing, for example, for the very early stages, valuing the role of parenthood. Now, it's crucial that we understand the importance of that in mental health and quality of early childhood development and its implications for the rest of their life and their impact on as the workforce and so on. And at the moment, again, we are far from being clear of the value and also putting it on our agenda, on our policy agenda, to the extent that it shifts the balance of what we are funding, what we're prioritizing, and what we're acknowledging. And again, here, to take a step back, why does all this matter? I mean, you all deal with data. You produce information, you produce knowledge, and you help us to understand the world we live in. But by doing what you do, you shape the future to a certain extent. And that is important always to remember. I work in academia, and somehow it's almost forgotten that we produce ideas, we produce information, and that matters also in the way we shape the future. So in prioritizing these themes, in prioritizing all the aspects of well-being that the OECD has identified and many other countries have contributed to, we shift that attention, and hopefully we shape that future towards that.
Monica, I think you wanted to come in on inequality, and then I have something else to ask you.
Yeah, well, just picking up on what Olivia was just saying, indeed, at the OECD, we've been working for more than 30 years on inequality trends, looking at how income inequality has been increasing. And we've also been looking at population aging over the years. And I think when we think about the future, we often focus a lot on digitalization at the moment because it's new, because it's exciting, because it's happening, everybody's somehow involved in it. But we tend to sometimes forget that the future will also be shaped very much by population aging and this increasing long-term trend in inequalities. And so what we did at the OECD, and I wouldn't be from the OECD if I wouldn't give you a few numbers now, we've been looking at what happens as inequality and aging go together. And why were we interested in this? Because we were seeing that it was suddenly having a policy impact. Pension reform was getting harder and harder. We know that people live longer and they need to work longer, but countries were encountering problems as people were saying, well, poor workers live shorter lives than rich people. So how are we going to deal with this when we increase pension ages? So we looked at the numbers and saw indeed that today, on average in OECD countries, a 25-year-old university-educated man can expect to live 8 years longer than his low-educated peer. So that's a lot, 8 years. So how do you reflect this? What do you do about this? And that's at age 25 already. And we also looked at how education, health, and employment are interconnected over the life course. And so somebody who's low educated will lose about a third of his or her earning over if he's in bad health, whereas somebody who's high educated will only lose half of that. So taking all of this together, you have to address inequality from an early stage on. As Olivia was saying, we have to start in early childhood and continue throughout the life cycle. Sounds easy, but that's exactly the thing that's hard to do. Because we have to think out of silos, we have to go across ministries, we have to share responsibilities, and we have to take this life course perspective on the future. And that's what's very hard to do at the moment for policymakers, because everybody's sitting in their silos and they're finding it hard to talk to their colleagues, even on a national level. Now imagine taking this to the international level.
Yes. As you deal in numbers, do you happen to know offhand what the life expectancy of somebody in the OECD who's born today will be?
It depends whether you're talking about men or women, but for children born today, I think for women it's more than 80, and for men it's slightly less, but the gaps between the gender gap in life expectancy is becoming smaller as women are working more, as women are adopting similar unhealthy health habits as men, for example, smoking and drinking. So there's a convergence between men and women, but it's definitely...
Okay, well, I think we'll come back to the, in Japan, for example, this idea of the 100-year-old, the 100-year life has become a kind of a big thing. That was a very popular book. So we might come back to this notion of people living longer and longer and how that affects well-being and some of the challenges that it throws up. But if, Enrique, I could turn to you, and I want to talk about something that's just sort of bubbled under the surface of our discussion, which is demographics. We talk a lot about the aging society. I think the median age in Japan is, if I remember rightly, something like 44. It won't be much less than that here in Korea. Fertility rate, 1.3, 1.2, 1.1, well below the replacement value of 2.1. That's the sort of OECD advanced economy part of the world, and increasingly other parts of the world, but certainly not all of the world. Africa, a continent I'm now quite familiar with, being a huge exception, where you have fertility rate of 4 and 5 in some countries, and where the population is expected to double from about 1 billion now to 2 billion by 2050, to go up to 4 billion by the end of the century. So we have this kind of very divergent demographics. What does this mean? Because we're told this is a crisis in both parts of the world. We have a crisis of lack of people aging, lack of people to do jobs in one part of the world, and supposedly we have a crisis of too many people, too many young people with no jobs in another part of the world. What does this mean for those distinct parts of the world, and what does it mean for the connection between them?
Well, first of all, I'm not a futurist because I don't believe that you can predict the future. But I do believe in scenarios. And therefore, I think the key is to identify the questions that you need to grapple with and then play out how they could go. And depending on how the reality answers those questions that you have, you'll have different scenarios. You can then play that back and turn that into policy reflections. So how do we avoid, you were asking before, what if we don't do anything? Well, it could get worse. What if we do the wrong things? Mm-hmm. And so how do we avoid that? And how we steer our efforts and the whole policy thinking towards the things that are more desirable. So at the BCG, we've done quite a lot of work on well-being that established a set of facts. And I think one of the really interesting sets of facts is that there are big differences across countries. And that is a very good basis for thinking about, so what is being done right and wrong in different places. For instance, and maybe we'll come back to that if we have time, but we've done a lot of work looking at how countries convert wealth into well-being. You have countries with the same level of wealth managing to achieve very different levels of well-being. And so why? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with policies, and therefore the loop that we are establishing here, you measure things, you put your focus on things that will help make sure that the policies are addressing the right things, not the wrong things. And in that context, of course, when you look at indicators of well-being to complement GDP, as we heard this morning, GDP plus, not instead of GDP, and think about both what's happening to people, so outcomes like health outcomes, and then people's perceptions, as we also heard this morning. So all of these things kind of are in the background, and we can come back to them. But going to your question, I think we are facing two unprecedented realities. Mm-hmm. One is the unprecedented fact that for the first time in history, you have part of the world where there's still population pyramids. We all learn about population pyramids. Well, there are some countries that do have them. So many African countries that you know well, countries in South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, countries in East Asia like Indonesia. You still look at the population structure and it is like a pyramid, right? And then you have many countries where it's like a spinning top. It's just about the opposite of a pyramid, right? And we still tend to talk about population pyramids, but there isn't anything in there.
The spinning top, I like that.
That is, or some countries is a little.
So what are the challenges in a spinning top economy? One, in other words, with fewer younger people, lots of people, middle-aged, and a lot of old people.
And made worse by longevity, because on top of the population structure having changed this way, these people at the top tend to just refuse to go away. So but
just to challenge you, they're surely made better by longevity. I mean, isn't that what we all want?
That's right. It could be made better if the setting was right, so that's a win-win. But then, it's the intersection of these two things that is a really interesting question. So what happens to migration? What happens to investment? Because jobs are going to be a crucial thing. I mean, in Africa, the fact that there's a very young population is a huge opportunity. It could be the source of major social explosions as well. And part of what may make the difference is investment. I mean, is investment going to go where the people are? And is technology going to be adapting to the needs and the skills and so on of those people, or is it going to happen independently? And this leads to the other unprecedented thing that we have, which is we have a digital generation gap. Right? And you have a generation that you could call the digital natives, that are people who have grown surrounded by digital technology. They are extremely comfortable with it. And in different countries, you can put that generation, that cohort starts more or less sooner or later, but they're all over the world. It's happened already, that you have people born in this digital age. Now, in many parts of the world, like here in South Korea, like in the north of Europe, in the US, the gap between that generation and older generations is not huge, because the older generations had access to computers and have been playing with the internet for longer, and there is a gap, and it could be important, and I'll come back in a moment to health, because I think it's an interesting twist to your question earlier. But in many countries in the world, where today you have less than a third of the population that has ever used the internet, the gap between those two generations is going to be enormous. We have never had a situation where technology has led to huge generational gaps of this sort. So how are they going to be played out? How are they going to be resolved in the labor force, in the media, in all kinds of places? And I think that is going to be, I mean, that's something that doesn't get enough attention, and it's going to be a huge, again, opportunity, or potentially a huge source of tensions and blockages. And then if you go back to the experience with use of technology in health and education, I spent a few years working at Cisco Systems. It was my way of immersing myself of the world of technology. One of the biggest frustrations my colleagues had, and this goes back more than 10 years, is there was enough technology readily available to do much better healthcare and to do it cheaper, and it wasn't happening.
It wasn't happening.
It was not happening. And the same thing in education. If you think about where technology should have made the biggest impact, and it has not, it's in education. Now, why? My hypothesis is that it's simple demographics. What's the average age of a doctor or a nurse in many countries? What's the average age of a teacher or a school principal in many countries? And therefore, we've seen disappointing adoption of technology that could help well-being a lot. And what I would predict, and here I'm going to contradict myself and be futurist for a moment, is a major inflection point when the digital natives come into positions of responsibility in the labor force, positions of influence in hospitals, positions of influence.
And then the potential of technology will take off.
It will, because they will have a completely different attitude to it, and the problem is not technology, the problem is adoption.
Yeah. Professor Park, if I could just bring you in quickly, just about this spinning top society. I think this is something that you've thought about.
Millennium Project Korea has done a few researches about 10 years ago about Korean population. Usually the future studies is based on demographic studies. And we found then, because of the lowest birth rate or fertility rate,
which is about 1.1 in Korea now, is that?
1.1 or 1.08 then, 10 years ago. Now it's a 0.98.
0.98, okay.
Yeah. Therefore, then we come up with a sort of result that 2300, there will be no one left in Korean
just turn out the
Peninsula.
lights.
Yeah, 2300, no one surviving. And in Japan, however, then 3,300. So it's about 1,000 longer surviving a nation. In Korea just disappeared to 2,300. That is crazy. And now the population is getting lower. I mean, the birth rate, also fertility rate is getting lower and lower every year. And most of general Korean women think that we do not need any children. That is because of high cost of living and the housing and education. But I'm trying to tell them, Korean ladies, that have more children, because it's not going to happen right away, but it will happen in 2030 or 2035.
Everything's going to get cheaper.
That, yes.
Deflation is coming.
Technology will take
Have more
off.
children.
Therefore, there will be very low, sort of, low cost of living, low housing, low education. Therefore, we have to be sort of, we have to learn more about futures rather than, thinking about present.
I mean, for what it's worth, personally, because I used to live in Japan, where it was also, there was this idea that the Japanese would just disappear, because if you extrapolate, then that's true. But I always really discounted this, because I just don't think that's what happens to societies. Once they, you reach a certain point and you realize, well, you can do something about it. Policy, people change, and people don't just sort of willfully drive themselves into
future studies is warning. It's not just correct or anything else. It's warning.
It's a warning.
We have to warn in 10 years in advance or something like that. Therefore, I'm doing my birth rate hike movement in Korea, and I have to tell them that Korea will be disappeared in something like 300 years. Yeah. So the people are aware of the situation.
Right. Do think of questions, because I will bring the audience in at some point. Olivia, I wanted to bring you in. This is a statistics, event. We're dealing in facts. But the future, as we're sort of learning, is very hard to extrapolate. It's very hard to, know through facts alone. And you've looked at versions of the future as seen through fiction. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, thanks, David. I actually wanted to indeed react, even though this is not necessarily the mode, because the emphasis on prediction is just one dimension of foresight and one way of thinking about the future scenarios. But also there are all the way to fiction and utopia as in the tradition of how to think about the future. And I wanted to initially just mention again that it's really important that we remember that we can desire the future, think about what it is that matters most to us, and then work backwards.
Did you say desire or design?
Yes, desire and design. But first you need to desire. So also what we call envisioning, for example. In terms of the material that you were referring, it is a very interesting exercise that we did as part of an EU-funded research project, which was about actually modeling European futures to 2050, but included a small little task, which was about how is the future actually envisaged within the arts, and in particular, written fiction, novels, and cinema. And we looked at across 150 years. So in a way, based on the material that we reviewed, I'm afraid the future doesn't look quite as bright as we have discussed here. And there are many things that one can say about that. But notoriously, the imagined future in the arts tends to be somewhat dystopian.
One thinks of 1984, Brave New World.
One thinks of yes, all the way to Avatar or Elysium for those of us who go to the cinema. And in fact, since we stopped tracking 2013, many more films have come out, in particular in the cinema, that are essentially dystopian and linked to technological advancement of one kind or another. Now, we can say a lot of things about this, but I think two are important here today. That we can learn, and we can learn a lot from this incredibly rich material that of course is biased in one interpretation, but let's remember that this is basically historical and social critique produced over decades by artists in many different countries. The fact that they're systematically envisaging a certain type of future, which essentially boils down to control of human beings by either human beings or machine, and limited freedom, and so on and so forth. The important thing about this material is its richness. It is basically out there for us to test our understanding of what futures can be like that we do not desire, or at least I think most of us do not desire. But they do have incredible seeds of warning that are beautifully, if you allow me that word, given that they're very dystopian, but they're beautifully elaborated for us. This morning, our keynote appealed to us, to our emotions, our capacity to actually feel, so that we can understand what it means, for example, to be poor or deprived or unable to do things. Now, we can go to the cinema and learn a lot about what we might want or might not want and backtrack. So I think the material is really important, even though it tends to be dystopian, but precisely because of that, it is an important warning.
Presumably it's our current angst playing out as well. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale, for example, was meant
Handmaid's
to
Tale?
not include anything that hadn't already happened. It was a view of the future, but it was also a view of our present and past.
Most indeed. And that is what is perhaps a little bit disturbing and, let's say, an important warning signal. A lot of the seeds of those futures, undesired futures, are present today and developing. So it brings back to the question of governance that you raise, the question of digital technologies and digital futures. What are we doing today to absolutely avoid going in that direction? Not enough.
Christine, I just want to change the subject slightly. We're here to kind of imagine the unimaginable, and I know you think about things, you sort of project quite far ahead, and you also maybe, think of things that we haven't thought about. Tell us a couple of things that you think some people in this room may not have thought about, and also tell us about the ring on your finger.
Yes, let's start with the ring. So it looks like a piece of jewelry, but what it really is it's a tracker. You're probably familiar with the Fitbit activity tracker, but this is primarily a sleep tracker. It's made in Finland, called the Oura ring, and it's been great for my personal well-being. So I highly recommend the Oura sleep tracking ring for personal well-being. In terms of looking to the long-term...
What does it do?
Yeah.
Sorry.
What does it do? It tracks all the different phases of sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, light sleep. When you wake up, it tracks heart rate. It tracks heart rate variability. For those of you who are wellness fans, that's an important wellness measure.
But doesn't this just make you more anxious? I mean, how does that help you?
For those of us who like to run little experiments on ourselves, you can see very clearly in the data what the effects are of changes in your own behavior. So I have changed my diet quite a bit. I change what time I go to bed, what I have for dinner, all kinds of things.
Okay. So it modifies your behavior. You don't drink coffee at night, for example.
It gives me the willpower.
Yes.
I have, with the data, well, people who are into statistics should understand this. If you have excellent quality data, you can take action on that if you really believe your data. And this gives me data that I trust.
Right. So that's that. Now
Right.
tell us a couple of things that we have not thought about that are going to shock us.
Right. So we mentioned cybersecurity just a bit. And I think here's the way to think about cybersecurity. Imagine if all the buildings in the world had no locks on them. No locks on the doors, no locks on the windows, right? That's sort of how we are now with our computers. Our computers are highly insecure. The only reason we are not suffering more from this now is that the attacks are mostly being done by human beings still. But one of the things that software advances, including artificial intelligence, will enable is the automation of attacks on your computers. And I don't just mean your laptop computers. I mean the computers that run your utility systems, your electrical systems. Imagine regional power outages. And we're not used to thinking about this, but with the right type of attack, it can actually damage the hardware of your electrical systems. These can take months to replace. So you can picture a regional power outage that is going on for months, and this would require an evacuation of a large region. The impact to wellness is profoundly bad.
And as we know, you can't, I mean, I was in Tokyo, during the earthquake and tsunami, and there were worries about kind of nuclear problems from Fukushima. And people were talking about, what happens if Tokyo were evacuated. It becomes very obvious very quickly that you cannot evacuate Tokyo. It's simply impossible.
Right.
So any such attack would be an act of war, would it not?
It would be. These have to be regarded from a military perspective, really. This is a type of a Cold War escalation into. It has to be regarded as an attack on the sovereignty of the nation and the well-being of all the people in the nation. Yes.
I mean, something that I've always wondered about is if just one day everyone woke up in America, let's say, and all their bank accounts had just been cleared out electronically. What would then happen?
I think it would be chaos because especially, I mean, being my age, I actually keep my paper bank statements. How many people do that today? Not too many, especially younger people. They're completely electronic. They have no record of anything. So
you couldn't go to the bank and say, I had $50,000 deposited?
Not unless you kept your own personal backups, which I would recommend.
Right. Tell us something else that may worry us or may please us.
Oh, maybe we better look for something positive. Okay. Okay, so we talked a little, I just touched on this question of people increasingly moving their business into the cyber world where it is not necessarily visible to government, which makes it harder to tax. It also makes it harder for corrupt officials in some countries to take their cut. How are governments going to grapple with that? Well, one way is, as David, you and I discussed briefly, was to go to a new system of taxation, one that probably some of you are aware of, which is called the land value tax. You want to tax things that can't disappear, and things that are very clear, where the ownership is perfectly clear, and correlate indirectly to consumption. Rather than taxing investment and savings and jobs, why not tax consumption? So a land value tax is one tax that is it's relatively fair, and it's thought to be environmentally beneficial because it concentrates development in areas that are already developed, rather than encouraging urban sprawl, which is bad for the environment, supposedly. So that's an upside.
Okay, I'm going to actually start with a question from the audience. If I think I hit this and I think it comes up there, doesn't it? No. Okay, I'm going to read it out. It says, in a finite economy, do we need to start embracing degrowth? This question always comes up. How do we end addiction to growth? Or should we end addiction to growth? Is, I guess, a corollary of that question. Enrique?
I mean, I think that the answer in some senses is exactly the motif for the forum. So you have to show how growth in many cases is measuring the wrong thing. So we've been looking at three simple measures of progress. One is GDP per capita. The other is objective well-being, based on work that we have done at BCG, but measuring outcomes essentially, health outcomes, education outcomes, access to infrastructure, governance, etc. And then the third is subjective well-being. So regardless of what the objective analysis and the GDP says, how do you feel? How do people feel? And when you look, in principle, it sounds like these things should be aligned. And if you do an econometric analysis, they're kind of aligned. But you start looking country by country, and what you see is very big differences. So you see some countries that are growing, and just three examples, for instance, Morocco, Poland, and Peru. Over the last 10 years, they've grown reasonably well. and both the objective and subjective well-being have improved. But then you have other countries where there's been a lot of growth, and neither the objective nor the subjective well-being have improved. And you have a lot of countries, including South Korea, where you have GDP growth significant and you have mixed signals from the well-being indicators. And most countries in the world are actually in that situation. And therefore, if you want to end the addiction to growth, you need to make sure that you put at the center at least these two other types of measures. The objective measure of what's actually happening to people, and the subjective measure of how do they feel about what's happening to them.
Yeah. I mean, lots of graphs do show, don't they, that you reach a certain income per capita, let's say 15,000 US dollars per capita. You know, the numbers obviously would vary. And at that point, you know, GDP might take off and it might double and treble. But your happiness, your well-being, differently measured, tends to flatten out. You know, does that mean, Olivia, that we shouldn't care about growth, that we should abandon growth? This idea of even degrowth, or is that just a kind of idealistic fantasy?
I'm a favor of idealism, so I wouldn't say that necessarily is the wrong thing. But first, I think we have to ask who is addicted to growth, because it's important to ask that question. Otherwise, we're talking, perhaps, we're not framing the problem quite rightly, as again, someone this morning said as an important
So who
step.
is addicted to growth?
So who is addicted to growth is the bottom 25% of the population in terms per income addicted to growth. Is it the 0.1%? I mean, I can't answer the question, but I'm sure that we could work towards answering that question with all the data that you gather. But it is, my point number one is that we need to ask that question.
But is
I
that a
also
question
want
that
to-
could, sorry to interrupt, but is
Yeah.
that a question that could be answered by data? I mean, isn't that a political question? I mean, you could say, look, the bottom 25% needs to grow because they need to catch up, and the top 0.1% don't need to grow. It's not really a question of data proving who wants to grow, is it?
I was trying to be positive about things. No, you're right. Let's say that data will always help, but that question needs to be asked in different quarters, let's say. What I think we need in terms of the degrowth or beyond growth agenda, there is certainly a lot that is relevant to this discussion, by which I mean the importance of well-being, yeah? Because a lot of the agendas, and they are agendas that have covered different continents, although degrowth in itself is a very European label, but it has drawn on many different traditions. And it does build the argument for looking at something different from growth, mainly by appealing to the importance of well-being. Again, what Angel Gurria said this morning, the ultimate goal, if it is well-being, then that's where we need to start.
So we need to grow well-being.
So what should we grow exactly? And better still, as many have argued, should we not be looking at the one thing that should grow absolutely unlimitedly, which is human potential? And this allows me to say one more thing about what we've discussed. I think you've noticed that we've discussed a lot about technology in answer to David's question, what does the future look like? And certainly I can tell you that all the dystopias I've looked at have a lot to do with technology. But I think, and I'd like to appeal to all of us, to think that futures can be colonized constantly by the way we frame our questions, the data that we gather, the knowledge that we produce. We live here in a smart city. Smart city has been extremely effective in colonizing how we imagine urban futures. But the question is also, who wants that kind of future? Who wants a smart city? For what purpose and what priorities does it answer? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have smart cities, But we should ask those questions before we build them, for example.
And just to stick with you, Olivia, and I will open it up, but the question began in a finite economy. You could broaden that in a finite planet, in a world of finite resources. And you asked the question, you know, who wants to grow? I mean, one answer of that is clear: humans. Bees don't necessarily want to grow. You're worried about bees, I know. Tell us why you're worried about bees.
We were talking about a Greenpeace video of robo-bees. I recommend that you Google it. It's very short. Yes, I think underlying one of the, perhaps I should answer your question by, again, putting on the table a little bit of a provocation. Well-being is absolutely the way to go. And if we can set it as the ultimate goal and actually stick to it and be consistent in the way we design policy and evaluate policy and everything that we do against those indicators, those criteria, we will certainly build a better world. But our understanding of well-being ought to be wider. And I think that all of us who know something about the data, about the state of the environment, WWF has just published yet another State of the Planet report, I think very, very recently. And sometimes I wonder what it must feel like, together with the OECD for 30 long years, to publish year in, year out, these trends that we do not want to see.
This is declining biodiversity.
Declining biodiversity in particular as a focus. As some of you may know, we are talking of probably the 6th extinction era. It's not good news. The point is, when we talk about well-being, if we talk about human well-being, let me extrapolate from the knowledge that I have, at least of the imagined futures. You may be well building yourself into, again, a dystopia. You can be very happy in a world that is almost dead. Is this what we want? Can we think of well-being as well-being of all life? And what does that change to your agenda and the data that you gather? And most importantly, the data that you present and which priority you give to it.
Just two quick points, and then I'll bring in Monica. I think we can safely say that, you know, if we're talking about well-being, then more production clearly does not equal more well-being. It might do under certain circumstances, but more production of plastic that is thrown into the oceans has an environmental impact. It's clearly good for GDP, both in producing it and in clearing it up. But it's not necessarily good for our well-being. And Christine, you were only saying earlier that there may be a link between plastics and falling testosterone levels. So, you know, there may be all sorts of implications, externalities, economists call them, that we don't understand. The other point that I would make about growth and degrowth is that's a kind of a luxury that we might, you know, in the world of the OECD, that we might be prepared and ready to talk about. But in extremely poor countries, some of the countries that I deal with in Africa, you know, that luxury is probably not yet there, and probably what they want is 20 or 30 years of very rapid growth of the sort that we've seen, say, in China. So we might have a kind of bifurcated answer to that question. But Monica, I'd like to bring you in. Where do you stand on this degrowth issue?
I think we have to think about what type of growth. We want growth in certain areas. For example, we want growth in social services. We know that all the countries that are aging rapidly now are desperately looking for more people to provide long-term care. We know, we spoke a lot about early childhood education and care. We know that many countries are struggling to well pay people who provide that child care. These are, at the moment, not attractive careers. They're badly paid. They offer no perspective of career development. And we have, at the OECD, we see now that those countries that are already rapidly aging are coming to us saying, please give us some good examples of how to invest in this. Please help us prove with numbers, with data, that this is an investment worth making, so that we can prove to our ministers of finance that this is good economics to promote growth in these areas. And again, if we come back to well-being, it's quite ironic we entrust what is most important to us as families, our children and our elderly relatives, to people who care for them. Yet, we don't respect the people who provide those services. So this is, for example, an area which we know we need growth, and so it's not about degrowth or stopping growth or something like that, but it's about promoting growth in areas where we need it.
Yes, well, I think that might bring us on, in a sense, to this next question, if it comes up. Is that coming up? No, I can't see what it says.
Over here.
Yeah. Does it say who will pay for universal basic income? No.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
Okay, so this question, I can't see if it's up there or not, but...
It's David, it's right there on the screen. Can you see?
Oh, okay. Who will pay for universal basic income if part of the population paying taxes shrinks? I think this is linked because GDP famously doesn't measure activities for which no money changes hands. So if you look after your aging relative or your child as a mother or daughter or son or father, that contributes 0 to GDP. If you do that in the context of an old people's home or childcare that's paid for, then hey, bingo, your GDP goes up. And likewise, if you renounce work to go and look after someone, GDP shrinks. Could not this be answered, Professor Park, with some form of universal basic income, where we would, in a sense, be paying for people?
Yeah, we've done the research for 2 years on this issue, and do income sources for this sort of UBI. 20% comes from reduction of tax havens, 20%, 12% from value-added tax, and 11% carbon tax, and 11% for tax massive wealth technologies, the emerging technologies, and 11% from license and tax robots. we tax robots. And 10% from
are they willing to
natural
pay?
resources and all this. So that therefore, we could sort of make the UBI happen by 2035. Because there are a lot of corruption at the moment in certain countries, and all those corruption money can go to UBI rather than being corrupt.
Okay, so I mean, let's accept for a moment that the source of funding is there. I mean, after all, we kind of know it's there. We're richer than we've ever been. So, clearly there's money around. So let's assume that we could put some towards universal basic income or some iteration version of that. Professor Park, is that a good idea, first of all, as a principle? Should we be paying people to do nothing, or should we be paying for them to do the things that they already do but which we don't value as part of our economy in a formal way?
Oh, we've done the research also on those, and several countries have practiced this UBI, and most people, about 70% of people who receive all these UBI are, first of all, healthier, less spending on the medical sort of, because they do not have any stress working and getting jobs and all that. And also, those people are more innovative and also trying to do something because they do not have to worry about tomorrow's food. So they go out, learn more, study more, trying to find new jobs and trying to have more creative inventions. So there are more positive sort of results than the negative results, such as doing nothing for just
We also talked earlier about a sense of self-worth, didn't we? These things that are quite hard to measure, but clearly, I say clearly, it would seem clear that, if you're not paid and seen to be kind of a useless or a burden on society, if you turn that on its head and say what you're doing is valuable and you get this amount of money, it would seem as though that might have a psychological impact as well.
Yeah.
Enrique, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I was going to take Olivia's lead to be a little provocative. And the way you reinterpreted the question made me think, but the mistake is in the I, in the UBI, right? If we see the intangible economy growing, and we are not going to capture that in the GDP statistics and so on, then the logical thing is to think about UBW, right?
W being well-being.
Yes.
Okay.
Right? So that, and then start not worrying about how you pay for it in the sense that some of these things will be provided in kind and will be part of this kind of new way of operating.
So
in an
beauty is
intangible
not
economy.
in the eye of the beholder, it's in the W of the beholder.
Right.
It's a new... Okay. Yeah, that's a very good point. Would anyone else like to talk about...
Well, I would just support, absolutely. I mean, we are here to say that well-being is the ultimate goal of everything we want to do. So if you can produce enough evidence and emphasize what well-being is about, its elements, and link it to these practices, it's essentially a very positive way forward.
Great. I'm again trying to change this question, but it's not doing it. But I want to ask another question here. In future, consumer gadgets may cost less and less, but their life is becoming shorter and shorter. How do you break the link? And should we make businesses pay for the waste generated? So this is, I guess, a question partly about corporate responsibility, about making, again, this word, externalities, making those explicit. Who would like to, shall I start with you, Christine? You think about the private sector. You know, gadgets do seem to be designed, you know, what are we on now with the iPhone X? I don't know what comes next.
Yes. My house is filling up with iPhones and old Macintosh laptops.
Right.
Don't really
So
know
the
what to
cycle
do.
seems to be getting quicker and quicker and quicker, and this
Right.
is based as much on fashion as maybe on real technological advance. Discuss. Certainly, I used to cover the pharmaceutical industry, and there was some truth in that. Tiny incremental advances were sort of put forward as huge leaps that really weren't. You know, are we in this cycle, and what responsibility does business have for that?
Well, I think to respond directly to the question, I think yes. I think we're going to have to hold the manufacturer, get the manufacturer involved in end-of-life processing of their products.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Japan is relatively ahead on this kind of thing. I think, you know, for example, I was talking about this ring. Well, there's a battery in here. Okay, so this is not something you should just throw in the trash. What am I going to do when it stops working? Right? In fact, I have one already that stopped working. And I think the answer has to be, at some point, ship it back to the company and let them figure it out. I mean, they're the only ones who know what's in here.
Yes.
How else can anybody else even process this stuff? So yes, I think we're going to have to get the original manufacturer involved in figuring out how to handle end of life on these products.
As long ago as 2002, I was living in Japan, and I remember it was cheaper to get a car than to get rid of a car. So I was given a car for free. I thought, what a fantastic deal. To get rid of this thing cost me an absolute fortune.
But that's the reality.
But that's
right?
reality.
Right. There's no sense in hiding it. We have to. And I admire Japan. For quite a while now, they've been stepping up to this and saying, let's be explicit about the costs of recycling these products.
So maybe that's 15 years in the future. It will be more expensive to dispose of something than to buy it. How about that for
I think it's very
strange idea that we think about?
It's extremely plausible.
Okay.
Yes.
Anyone else on gadgets?
Yeah.
Enrique?
But I think if you just take this to the next logical step, is that the consumer is the answer. Because the consumer will start demanding, I mean, everybody talks about the consumer shifting from products to experience, right? So part of the experience of the consumer is going to be the whole cycle. And the consumers will start, I think, rewarding the companies that offer that to you. And I think that making sure that people communicate that and feed that back will be a very important part of the answer, and a very simple kind of bottom-up part of the answer, totally consistent with this trajectory of people valuing the experience that the product offers, not the product itself. And if the experience is detrimentally affected by the fact that you worry about what happens to the leftovers, or having to get rid of it becomes a nuisance, well, next time you buy something, maybe you'll think about that.
Yes. Olivia, there's an amazing question for you that I really like that I'm going to bring up if I can, which is, how is the future influencing the present? Sorry to put you on the spot, but it's a very good, very neat little question. I like that.
Well, I would answer that question with the notion of the colonized futures and how they actually influence the present, meaning that those messages that we are able and successful in putting out, and technological companies have been extremely successful at giving us images of what the future is going to be like, then have a sort of reverse effect into policies today and what we pursue. And again, a smart city is a very good example, because it was imagined and is now reality in many countries. It's part of our policies. It's linked also to sustainable development of urban areas, sometimes more successfully than others. It's also linked to well-being, because with the aspect of technology and advanced technology, of course, it is a promise of a better quality of life for the aging, for the young, in many different directions. So the future has a very direct impact in that sense.
So what's the lesson of that? That we need to be careful what we imagine, be careful what we wish for?
I frame it in the following way. I think that we have to sit back a little bit and ask ourselves, just because we can do something, does it mean that it is something we need? And does it mean that it is something that we desire? Or, to use OECD language, that we need and aspire to?
Right. Well, there's an example from today's news. So supposedly in China, there's been a successful gene editing, and a baby has been born. His genes have been edited. I think that it's yet to be proven that this has actually happened. I think one of the parents or both of the parents had HIV, and the baby has been edited so that it will not have. That is something we can do. Should we do it?
Right, so then the next follow-up question or follow-up reflection. How much do we value the discussion of values? Now, sitting from where I normally sit, which is academia, one of the big questions and that we are posing ourselves is, what is the future of academia? What is the future of universities? And in that, I'm getting to the point, one big question rising is, what happened to our capacity to engage with notions of values, of normativity, of ethics? And the answer is, we're not doing very well. We've put them all in one corner and emphasized all sorts of other forms of knowledge. And there is a big appeal to widen the ways that we know, widen the sources of knowledge that we use, embrace a certain level of diversity, which applies as a recommendation to many other arenas, including what kind of futures we
Yeah,
might
so this is this old debate really about science and ethics taking different courses, and they need to be put back together again.
We need to join those urgently, especially with the digital dimension and what...
Monica, you wanted to come in on this one.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on the question how the future influences the present, and I would like to come back to something that Princess Laurentine said in her address. We have to be very careful about the bubble, and for us it's very cool to imagine all kinds of things about the future and think about scenarios and is going this way or that way. Outside of the bubble, people are terrified, and that is what we can see in their voting behavior, in the way that people are worried about things that are being magnified through social media, but also what they're living in their daily lives, and what we might think are desirable things for the future and for well-being is not necessarily what people are experiencing. And in that sense, because of the way things are being perceived, how threats are being, complex problems are being perceived as globalized, and suddenly everybody seems affected by it, even though in reality, many people will not be affected by many of the things. For some people, life will just continue in where they are and will not immediately be threatened. So I think we have to be very careful how we extrapolate from the bubble and move from the bubble into the real world where we really do put people at the center. And this is something we should not be forgetting, because otherwise we are sitting in our bubble discussing, and the reality is taking our world in a very different direction where we can make ourselves irrelevant in our bubble.
Would you like, just very quickly, and then I wanted to bring in, there was a question which seems to have disappeared off my screen about gender equality, and we haven't discussed gender equality. So how might that look given some of the changes that we're seeing in the world today, and how do we think about gender equality as a well-being issue? But I think as part
before the gender equality, I would like to mention that our futurists say that future is to invent it rather than confront it or just find out. North-South dialogues will give us a huge opportunity to invent a new future. And with the North-South dialogue, the defense spending will be reduced tremendously. And with the defense spending reducing, with the cyber systems in the future anyway, but with the North-South dialogues, we have currently 600,000 North Korean soldiers, 400,000 South Korean soldiers, 1 million soldiers, such as the population of Incheon or some whole city. What can we do if we are just, reunified or just talking one another? So we have to invent a new North-South relations or dialogues, whatever it comes within a year or two. It is currently happening here in Korea, and nobody seems to sort of understanding the impact and the opportunities and challenges that are coming to us. So I would like to get your opinions on this.
Reunified Korea.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
The gender issue, who would like to? Christine.
Well, if we look at fertility around the world in the wealthier countries, say, I think I've read that of the wealthier countries, France has had some success in having policy changes that result in maintaining the level of gender equality in the workplace that they already had, but also encouraging women and enabling them financially to go ahead and get their fertility level up to where they personally would like it to be. In other words, will their job be there when they are ready to come back to work? Are they going to be able to maintain their income at the level that it was before? So I think there are opportunities for wealthier countries who are facing this reduction in fertility to make policy changes that will work. We've seen at least one case of that. So I think it can be done. It just takes some creativity and facing and asking. I think you can probably just ask women why, the fertility levels you're seeing are not their preferred ideal ones.
Right.
And saying, why are you not having the children you want? Generally, it's an economic issue.
Olivia, and then I think there's a question here.
Just a quick additional comment on gender issue. I think it is an incredible wealth that we have to look at the world from a female and a male's perspective. And the visions, the way we look at the world are fundamentally different. And we need to do much more to bring those two types of voices together, to contribute, to think about these things, to think what does well-being mean and what.
So would you say at the moment we have an overly male view of what well-being means?
I would.
Yes, I'd agree.
If I may dare so. But it's nice to have
Professor Stiglitz, I think that is. Is the microphone on?
Hello. Now it's on. Thank you. It's actually Russell Mills from Business at OECD. But anyway, thank you for the compliment. What can we learn from the past to help our future? If you think back 100 years and you think about the electrification of our households, it must have been very frightening. Hundreds of millions of jobs were going to disappear, especially relatively boring jobs like washing clothes. Some households spent 1,000 hours a year doing that. So very frightening, all those jobs about to be destroyed. What actually happened? Well, the biggest change was all the time given back to people, especially the time given back to mothers and their daughters. Biggest impact was the highest increase in girls' education we've ever seen. So big risks, but even bigger benefits. So now I have a question, but I think if we want to change our future, maybe we need to change some of the rules for our future. So David, I'm going to ask my question to you as the moderator. Is the media spending too much time frightening us in this digitalization discussion about all the bad things that are going on and not spending enough time about all the opportunities? So it's a question for you as moderator on media.
No, it's a fair question, and it was actually one that I was going to end. I'm not quite sure how much time we've got left, but it may be one that I develop and ask the rest of the panel. I mean, Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, which many of you will be familiar with, really says that, and I think there's an example of this here today, and probably there will be. We tend to look at the future, and we even tend to look at the present. We look at what's wrong. We look at the crises. You know, journalists write about when a bomb goes off, when people sink in a boat on Lake Victoria, or when there's an outbreak of Ebola, or when there's war in Yemen. And of course we do. I mean, that's perfectly understandable. Those are real events that we should be dealing with. But as a result of that, one can view that as the view of what's the objective view of the world, and what we're not seeing is everything else. So I mean, Rosling's point is that we would be amazed, because if we look at the news, we'll think that, for example, girls don't go to school, and of course there are countries where girls don't go to school, northern Nigeria, parts of Afghanistan, but he says, and I can't remember the number, but I think it's if boys go to school for 9 years on average, or maybe 10 years on average across the planet, how many years do girls go to school? And the answer is 1 year less. In other words, the gap is not nearly as big as we might think. Questions about life expectancy much higher than we imagine. There are all sorts of ways in which the world is actually a better place than we're led to believe if we only read newspapers and if we only kind of worry about the day-to-day. And what gets lost in that is the kind of the long-term trend. And I would absolutely agree with that we ought to be cognizant of the fact that in general we're all living longer, that in general there are fewer wars, that in general more people have access to, what Amartya Sen might call, kind of agency over their lives. Of course, there's huge portions of the world that don't and can't and aren't. But if you take this overall, and that I think is very important. I mean, I'd like to throw that open to the panel, and also to throw in something else, which you sort of raised in your question, implicitly anyway. And this is this idea from Robert Gordon, which is that actually a lot of the great innovations have already happened. We imagine that we're living in this time of unprecedented change because of the internet, robots, AI, etc. There is an alternative school of thought that says that's just not true, that the great advances have already happened. We learned to fly. We might be able to fly a bit faster one day. We learned how to make the steam engine. We learned about antibiotics. We learned about sanitation, clean water. All the big advances have actually happened already, and that we're a little bit too obsessed with this age of change that we're living through. And maybe the future isn't as different from the present as we think. So I'd like to throw those two questions. Are we too negative? And are we too wrapped up with this idea that we're living in this fast-paced world that's changing faster than ever before. Maybe in some ways it's not. Monica.
Well, I think that the question is how you define big changes. Of course, steam engines or even, fire, things like that were big changes, but the fact that people can communicate in real time around the world, wherever are connected, have access to educational resources, almost unlimited, all of these things I would consider huge changes as well. But they're perhaps not as material because they're not as engineering based.
Yes.
But I think we also lack imagination, maybe what else is coming out there. And where the things are different now today, I believe, is we talked about climate change, but not a lot. There is a different sense of urgency now, not because things weren't more difficult before in a certain way. They've always been difficult, but now there's a sense of we really don't have much time left before the well-being, the material well-being of many people on this planet will be seriously affected. And I think that's where maybe things are different now.
Well, I wanted to end on a happy note. You said we don't have much time left. In fact, we have no time left. It just flashed up on the screen that our time is over. So I'm going to have to end this slightly prematurely. I was told there was going to be a countdown clock, and in fact there wasn't.
Oh.
So time has been cut. Olivia, you look as though you want to say something. Can you end on a positive note?
Yes, let's end on a positive note. Past is really important. It tells us a lot of things. What we look at it, how we look at it, though, matters. So we've tended to tell a positive story about our evolution, and by and large, Hans Rosling is a master at that. And I agree, but there is the downside, which is the ecological side. And we do live on a planet that we do quite like. There are several others we might occupy. They don't look pretty at the moment. So let's do the best we can with what we have here. And the agenda of this forum is the way to do that. Because in the past, we have not prioritized well-being. We have not prioritized human life, let alone all life. Can we do that from now on? And what will that future look like if we do that? We can learn that from the past. We can plan that for the future. So
I think that's a perfect way to end it. So the future of the planet's well-being, ladies and gentlemen, is in our hands. We should act upon it. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of the first roundtable session. Thank you once again to the moderator and the speakers for the enlightening session. Please give them another big round of applause. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on to the luncheon. I'm sure that after a long morning session, you're very hungry. Please follow the directions of our staff to the premier ballroom on this floor. And don't forget to bring your luncheon coupon available in your name badge. And of course, to prevent any loss, please bring your belongings with you and leave the interpretation receivers on your chairs. And the press conference on the launch of the report of the high-level expert group on the measurement of the economic performance and social progress will also be held here at this grand ballroom shortly. So we ask for your interest as well. It's open to all participants, so please feel free to attend. Lunch will still be available for all participants after the press conference at the premier ballroom. So before you go for lunch, please make sure to bring along your luncheon coupon. Also from 1 p.m., the IFEZ Wellbeing Economy Government's Statistics Korea Social Enterprise Promotion Agency, and the Chungham Co. Ltd. will also give brief presentations on their work in their premier ballroom lobby. I kindly ask you for your continued interest and participation. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great luncheon, and we'll see you back here in the afternoon. Thank you very much. And also, we ask for your continued interest in the press conference. Thank you very much.